Good evening, everyone. My name is Ty Barnes, Vice President for Institutional Advancement. And on behalf of our president, Dr. Ernest McNeely, and the entire Allen University faculty and staff, it is my honor to welcome you to the Boeing Institute's Fall Symposium. Tonight, we gather in the spirit of learning, dialogue, and civic engagement. The Institute was founded to provide a platform where diverse voices can come together to address the pressing issues of our time with both courage and civility. This evening's discussion, exploring the role of the federal government in education, could not be more important. We are grateful to our distinguished moderator and panelists for sharing their expertise and perspective with us, and to each of you for choosing to be here and to engage in this critical conversation. Thank you to Boeing for their vision and support in helping us create a space where thought leaders, scholars, and community members can exchange ideas that move us forward. We look forward to an evening that challenges us, inspires us, and strengthens our commitment to building a more informed and inclusive society. Welcome, and let's begin. Inez Tenenbaum practices law with Weish PA in Greenville, South Carolina, advising clients on matters involving the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission and consults on education policy for national and state organizations. She served as chairman of the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission from 2009 to 2013, appointed by President Barack Obama and unanimously confirmed by the Senate. During her tenure, she implemented the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, advancing the world's strongest crib standards and lowest lead limits for children's products and mandatory toy and product safety standards. From 1999 to 2007, Ms. Tenenbaum was South Carolina's State Superintendent of Education. She secured $750 million in state bonds for school construction, leveraged to $1.75 billion with local support resulting in over 140 new schools. Under her leadership, South Carolina achieved the fastest rate of academic improvement in the nation, with the prestigious journal Education Week ranking South Carolina #1 for academic standards, assessment, and accountability. Ms. Tenenbaum earned degrees from the University of Georgia and the University of South Carolina School of Law. She received multiple honorary degrees, numerous awards, and South Carolina's highest civilian honor, the Order of the Palmetto. She and her husband, Samuel Tenenbaum, reside at Caesar's Head here in South Carolina. I present to you the Honorable Inez Tenenbaum.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Vice President Barnes. It is my honor to welcome you to Allen University's program on the role of federal government in education, which is sponsored by the Boeing Institute on Civility. It's great to be back on the Allen campus. I was on the board of directors here at Allen for many years. Tonight, we have two very accomplished individuals who will share their perspective on the role of the federal government in education. In alphabetical order, Professor Derek Black holds the Ernest F. Hollings Chair in Constitutional Law at the University of South Carolina's Joseph F. Rice School of Law, where he also directs the Constitutional Law Center. He is one of the nation's leading scholars on educational law, constitutional law, and civil rights, with a particular focus on equality and fairness in public education. Professor Black's research has been published in top journals in this country, and he has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court and by numerous federal courts in their cases. He's also the best-selling author of 4 books on educational law and policy. He frequently provides expert testimony in major school funding, voucher, and federal education policy cases. Professor Black began his teaching career at Howard University School of Law, where he founded the Educational Rights Center. Before entering academia, he litigated education cases with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Carol Swain, who has an amazing history. Dr. Swain was born into poverty in rural Virginia and went on to earn 5 degrees. She achieved early tenure at Princeton University and later served as a professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. Today, she is a nationally recognized political scientist, best-selling author, and frequent news commentator. Dr. Swain has held 3 presidential appointments and served on bodies such as the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the 1776 Commission. She has been cited 3 times by the U.S. Supreme Court and has authored or edited 12 books, along with numerous opinion pieces in prominent publications. In 2025, she received the Frederick Douglass Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of her decades of conservative scholarship and service. Dr. Swain is the founder and CEO of Carol Swain Enterprises and serves as a fellow at the Institute for Faith and Culture. She resides in Nashville, Tennessee. So welcome, Professor Black and Dr. Swain. Tonight, I will ask each of our panelists a series of questions. We will alternate alphabetically, and both of our panelists will have the opportunity to comment on each question. I will ask Dr. Black, Professor Black, the first question, and the second question, Dr. Swain will go first. So, Professor Black, what are the major federal statutes or milestones that establish the role of the federal government in education?
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks to Allen University for inviting me, and thanks for letting me share the stage with such 2 distinguished individuals. But as to this question of the federal role and where it comes from, I mean, it really starts on a fundamental level on what a Republican form of government is. And so I don't want to put anyone to sleep, which is probably a risk at this time of the evening, but the United States Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government. And so in that respect, Congress has always treated the provision of public education as being an aspect of a Republican form of government. Thus, it's no surprise that all 50 state constitutions guarantee public education in them. If we fast forward to the federal role in a much more modern era, that really comes from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1964, which was part of both the war on poverty to provide funding for low-income students, but also to create a financial carrot and ultimately a stick for southern school districts that refuse to desegregate. And the Elementary and Secondary Education Act has expanded since then, and so now it covers a lot more, as of course the Honorable Inez Tenenbaum knows, covers a lot more than just low-income students. And so, but I'll stop at that lest I put folks to sleep.
Thank you. Dr. Swain?
Well, there's not anything I can add to that very factual summary, so I'll use my time to tell you a little bit about me. I was one of 12 children born and raised in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia. I dropped out of school after completing the 8th grade. I earned a high school equivalency, and from a community college earned 5 college and university degrees, and never set out to become a university professor. And when it comes to the role of the federal government in education, I would go back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when the federal government became involved in trying to end discrimination based on sex, color, race, national origin, and religion. And that's when the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution and the protections that benefited a lot of people like me really took off.
Thank you both for that question. So let's talk about the impact of the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education regarding the role of the federal government in public education. Now, that was 71 years ago. And since the Brown decision, has the role furthered the aims implicit and explicit in the Supreme Court's decision? And Dr. Swain, I'll ask you to go first.
I was born in 1954, and that was the year of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And so the Supreme Court ruled that schools across America had to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. In Virginia, it was 1968 or 1969 before I attended my first integrated school, because Virginia engaged in massive resistance. And with the Brown versus Board of Education, what we found was that resistance to integration wasn't just about the South, it was like across the country, but in different ways. And so there was unexpected resistance in some quarters, and there were other places where it worked smoothly. And out of that decision, we ended up with battles over busing. And one of the things that you should be aware of is that Black parents were not any more enthusiastic about their children being bused than white parents. And so did Brown versus Board of Education really benefit racial and ethnic minorities? I can tell you that I know a lot of Black civil rights scholars and people that would say no, and that Black kids were doing better in segregated schools. And I can tell you that I spent, the first, from the first grade to the 7th grade in segregated schools, and I was not behind. And I had been taught by my teachers that the white kids would be ahead of us because they had better books. And what actually happened was I got the confidence of learning that I was smart in the Black school and I was smart in the white school, and that white people were not smarter than Black people. That's what I got out of the integration. But as far as the quality of education that Black kids got in America, I believe that many people my age would say that it deteriorated after Brown versus Board of Education.
Professor Black?
Yeah, I would come at this from two ways, sort of the legacy of Brown and sort of the immediate impact. The legacy of Brown, without a question, fundamentally transformed public education, not just for Black children, but all children. That after the court announces in Brown versus Board of Education that separate but equal based upon race is unconstitutional, we have a series of statutes and other decisions that begin to extend the equality rationale to women, to students with disability. We ultimately have ELL students at this point, English language learners, homeless students. And so this idea that all students must have equal access to education, and that, again, extends to various different demographic groups, is really an outgrowth of that idea in Brown. And then, of course, we all here in South Carolina know the Abbeville decision, and it certainly has not achieved all that it should in terms of school funding, but you also see state courts saying, wait a minute, poor children under their state constitutions deserve an equal opportunity in education, and maybe additional funding, not just the same or less. And so again, that is a ripple effect of Brown. As to Black children themselves, right? We can paint with broad brushes. Certainly there are children who were harmed, there are ones that were benefited, but the cold hard data does show that if you look at the closing of the achievement gap between Black and white children shrunk more during the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, which really desegregation didn't start until the 60s, but shrunk more during that period than any other education reform that has happened since then. So as a data point. Now, to be clear, it wasn't sitting next to white children that made Black children magically learn or vice versa, but it was the reduction of the isolation of poverty, right? And so certainly some Black children, particularly in your large urban centers, were in high concentrated levels of poverty and deconcentrating poverty regardless of race, right? For both white children and Black children, Latino children, has a positive impact on educational outcomes.
Could I say something else
Please.
about that?
Sure.
One of the, it wasn't just Brown v. Board of Education, but I would also say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 opened up opportunities that a lot of the Black professionals had been denied. And what happened was that in the Black schools, there were highly qualified Black teachers that could not teach in the white schools. After the Civil Rights Act legislation passed, then many of those highly qualified teachers left those schools. And so that, I think, was one factor in, I don't believe black kids generally fared as well. And there were other things too that worked, I believe, to the disadvantage of black kids. The disciplinary rates, and this still goes on with the black children tending to be suspended more in schools that were integrated. I mean, that's something that has gone on for decades. And I can tell you that in the segregated schools, there were not the same kinds of disciplinary problems that the black teachers seemed to have a better grip on the classroom when it came to dealing with black children.
Thank you. Professor Black?
Not a point of disagreement, but actually a fantastic book to Dr. Swain's point came out by one of my colleagues called Pink Slip. And so it came out just about a year ago, and it really sort of traces this history of the loss of black educators. And I think, that's sort of separating the question of black educators from black students, because ultimately I think the black educators ended up suffering as much as anyone because they simply lost their jobs as a result of, during integration, white principals and white superintendents not bringing them in. Can't go back and reverse history, but I would imagine things would have looked a lot better had we protected those opportunities of black teachers in the schools as they became integrated.
All right, Professor Black, here's the next question. How is the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause applicable to the current landscape in public education?
Yeah, I mean, public schools are state actors, and so they're subject to the Equal Protection Clause. And essentially what it guarantees is equal or non-discrimination against students based upon race, sex, disability, ethnicity. With that said, lawyers require evidence of intent, and so it's not that the Equal Protection Clause requires equal results or equity. To get a remedy, one has to demonstrate intentional discrimination. And so, in large part, I would say that the Equal Protection Clause does not have a significant effect in terms of African American students, at least access to education at this point. There's a lot going on, as many of you would know, around issues of sex and gender and sexual orientation. The Equal Protection Clause is playing a large role in that now, but at least in terms of race, sort of an aggressive application of equal protection in regards to race has changed dramatically, I guess, over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Dr. Swain?
And I would say that it's changed in that the Equal Protection Clause is being applied to white people, because at one time, and like I've taught courses on civil rights, and all the white kids, over the years, it was like, oh, civil rights, that's something, for minorities. And I would say that in the last decade, around the debates over DEI and critical race theory, that white people have discovered the civil rights legislation, and white men have discovered it, because when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was first passed, the focus was on women, bringing about equal opportunities for women, equal opportunities for minorities. We now live in a society where the demographics have changed, certainly with regards to race. There are many states around the country that are majority minority, they're not majority white. Probably in the next 10, 15 years, is it longer? Whites will be a minority in the US, and so civil rights laws apply to them now. They are protected by the Equal Protection Clause, and they know it. So be careful. Now, when it comes to discrimination, it's not like something that white people do to black people, it's also something that minorities do to white people, and their remedies, the same remedies that some of us have exercised when we were discriminated against, white people can do the same thing now. So people that are in positions of power, or you have to be very careful to make sure that you're treating everyone equally because of the Equal Protection Clause and because of our civil rights laws.
I mean, I guess I would just add to that, though, I guess maybe a little bit of skepticism of that. I mean, I taught at Howard Law School, so I certainly know what it is to be a white man in a room with many other black people. And never experienced any problem at all at Howard University. I was there for a decade. Because I think there is this, and of course, you know, Howard's not everywhere. But,
Sir, the world has changed a lot.
well, I mean, the fact that, yeah, but what I was going to say, though, I mean, ultimately, I think this question of the Equal Protection Clause, and this was a debate that went on in the court for a long time, I'm not so sure that it has been, you know, black people or Latino people discriminating against white people, right? I mean, that would maybe raise some people's concerns, but rather white people adopting race-conscious policies that maybe disadvantage them. And one of the debates was, do you have any reason to be suspicious of that, right? Which is if a white majority is deciding to adopt a policy that is more inclusive and maybe brings more diversity into the school, is there a reason for us to be suspicious of that? Because if white administrators are adopting that, surely they're in a position to protect themselves as well, given that they're the decision makers. And so I'm not saying there's absence of discrimination, but the idea that, you know, black people are discriminated against white people on a regular basis is not, at least not something that I have personally experienced.
Well, I guess I'm speaking in the context of we know that race-based affirmative action in higher education has been struck down, and there was an executive order reversing the executive order from 1965 that instituted preferential treatment. And the climate has changed, but a lot of that does have to do with the fact that there have been situations, legal would-be cases that have been settled, but white people are more likely now to document, just like we documented in the past, and press for their own rights. And so, you know, maybe when you were at Howard, it was great that you were at Howard, you had a great experience, but I'm telling you that the world has changed, and I'm telling everyone in this room that the world has changed, and we can't do things the way they were done in the past, and we can't have the same expectations.
Well, I think to your point, certainly there are a lot of white plaintiffs using the Equal Protection Clause, which I think was your initial. I certainly don't contest that. I guess I wonder whether their
but
claims
their
are valid.
rights under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it protects all persons against discrimination based on race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and, you know, disability, sexual orientation. Now, all persons are protected, and that includes white people and it includes men. And so men have either settled or they've won cases where they had a female boss and that person disparaged them. And this can take place in educational institutions, all kinds of institutions. So I think that the Equal Protection Clause, which we're talking about, is very important. It protects all persons, and it's more likely to be applied today in a way that we're individuals. And so everyone has rights to bring a claim if they're discriminated against. And I think that's good that we've reached this point, because our nation is so diverse that we need to make sure that we are protecting everyone's civil rights.
So you're saying because the demographics are changing and the white population is and will become a minority, then it will be, you're saying who will be bringing equal protection cases?
No, people are already bringing the cases,
Okay.
and that's one reason why the Supreme Court struck down the race-based affirmative action. We know that Asian students were the plaintiffs, and they were being discriminated against in the same way that Jewish students had been discriminated against. And I guess I'm saying that the Equal Protection Clause was always meant to protect all persons, but it hasn't always been applied in that way. And there's a new landscape, and I don't think it's going to go back to the way it was before, because of the demographics of the nation changing in such a way. And I think that when it comes to are we all going to get along, I think for us to all get along, it's going to require a different mindset and a different approach. We're not going to go back. I don't believe, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, I don't think things will ever go back to the way it was like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so it's important for students, you know, to look at this landscape. I think it's going to require a different mindset about how you apply yourself, how you conduct yourself, all of that.
Okay. Well, let's move on. And Dr. Swain, you have the next question. How did your personal journey in your own educational attainment and your professional experience in education shape your views on the role of the federal government? And have your views evolved over time?
My views have evolved over time politically, and I can say, like I would describe myself as a person that benefited greatly from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race. And so when I reached college, I reached it in an environment where there was a lot of focus on outreach. There was a search for underserved populations, so there was outreach. There were jobs being advertised in neighborhoods and in places and at schools where they weren't before. There was a stress on equal opportunity and non-discrimination and integration. And integration doesn't mean the same as inclusion. With the integration, it was about bringing in people that had been shut out and they became part of the whole, or they became part of the team. And that's very different from how we're using the concepts of equity and inclusion.
Professor Black?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a graduate of Clinton High School, which is the first traditionally white high school in the South to graduate a black student. And so, I certainly have that personal experience which shaped me. Of course, that was long before I was born when Bobby Swain graduated from Clinton High School. But growing up in that community, it certainly had an impact on me. And then maybe it's no surprise that I went on and worked at the Office for Civil Rights, the Department of Education at one point, and then at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights doing desegregation work at one point. So in terms of the federal law and federal government's role in education, certainly it's been something near and dear both to my personal experience but my professional experience. But I think we get older and we get wiser. Hopefully we get wiser. We're going to get older whether we like it or not. But
There's some old fools.
Hopefully I'm not in that category quite yet. But,
not you.
but one of the things I think, as a cultural matter that sort of has bothered me and I've worried about as of late is, as important as the federal government is, and I do insist that it is incredibly important in public education, it does have its lanes that it needs to stay within. And when it goes too far, it creates backlash. And I think one of the things that happens with whether it be state, federal, or local power is that power wants more power, right? And so, I have, and I don't want to name names and that sort, but, I certainly have seen the federal administrations try to expand their footprint in public education. I was part of the Obama-Biden transition team, the first administration, and probably much to their chagrin, I testified against the department a few years later, not because I disagreed on their substantive policy, but because Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education at the time, was holding waivers over the states and demanding policy changes that I just said, look, they may be good policies, but I don't think they're within your power to demand them. And I don't think that Arnie Duncan was a bad man, and I certainly have tremendous respect for President Obama, but there are limits to power. And so you've seen over the years that regardless of political party, right, that the federal executive does overreach. And I would say, in my view, right now we see the greatest overreaches from the Department of Education in the history of the United States of America.
What? We're trying to get rid of it.
That the current administration is insisting unilaterally, without doing full investigations, without giving universities an opportunity to see the findings of those investigations, without giving them an opportunity to come up with what their remediation plan would be, to say, no, on Monday we're sending you a letter, Columbia University, and if you don't accept our terms by Wednesday, we are terminating your funds. Well, there's a statute that actually dictates the United States of America. There's a rule of law, and that's not the process. But at this point, we have a federal executive that insists that because it is in control, it can do whatever it wants. And so my point isn't to argue about the underlying policies. It is, yes, not just this administration, but the prior administrations have overreached. And I think that pattern in practice gets greater and greater with each administration, which is simply to say there is a very important role for the federal government, but we do have to be concerned about its overreaches.
And I would say to that question, too, is that the federal government is too large. And when it comes to K through 12 education, I believe many states have done a better job, and the federal government needs to get out of the way. And we have federalism in this country, and power needs to be returned to the states. And when it comes to Columbia University and Harvard University, those universities needed to be held to account because of the discrimination that was taking place against Jewish students and faculty, and there were violations of their civil rights. And so the role of the federal government is to protect the civil rights of people. That's one of the roles they assumed after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so I think in those particular situations that they had to step in, and the anti-Semitism that's taking place in this nation today, I think is shocking, and I think it's shameful, and I think there is a role for the federal government, and if the presidents of those universities had done what they should have done, there would not have been a need for the federal government to step in. And the federal government's assumption of that role had a lot to do with petitions from students that had actually been accosted and harassed on campus, and some of them physically. If it were black students, we would want the federal government to, well, we did, and it happened. And so the Jewish students were in the same situation, and that's why Harvard and a lot of those elite schools got into trouble with the administration.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a couple of things to that, which if you, and it's about process, right? Number one, there may be one student who's been discriminated against based, a Jewish student discriminated against at Columbia University. There may be 1,000. There may be 200, there may be 500. I don't know the answer to that question. And the answer is...
The numbers out there, well, in some ways,
if I could finish.
Let Professor Black finish. And let's go on to the next question after you finish.
Yeah, so point being that whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 500, I would agree. Any student discriminated against based upon race, religion, et cetera, should have a remedy. But there's a process. Investigations must occur. Opportunities for remedies must occur. And to compare what this administration did as compared to what prior administrations did during the 60s is a good comparison, because I'll sit here and tell you that the recalcitrant segregationist school districts in the South were never dealt with so quickly and so unilaterally as this administration has dealt with universities, because there's investigations that must occur.
All right, let's talk about technology and future challenges. Professor Black, this question: as technology transforms education at all levels, what is the role of the federal government in ensuring that all students have access to technology?
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I don't know. That one is, to me, not a huge. I mean, ultimately, I don't really think that as an education policy, the federal government needs to be dictating anything about technology. With that said, certainly, we know here in Columbia and the state of South Carolina that I forget the name of the bill. The infrastructure bill certainly expanded broadband internet, not just to universities, but to communities that didn't have it. So it's certainly appropriate for the federal government to expand infrastructure and access to technology, but dictating how that technology is used in particular schools and education institutions, I don't really think that's the business of the federal government unless, and again, please stay with me for just one moment, unless it affects commerce, and in that instance, the federal government has a direct role in regulating interstate commerce, as you certainly
right.
know.
I would say that it's an evolving area, and that as far as making sure that state and local schools, educational institutions, and my interest is mostly K through 12, I think that the state governments and the local governments, that they have to make sure that there's access. The state governments are the primary funders of education, and then the federal government comes in and their grants. So I think that technology is certainly the future. It's here. A lot of the education that children are getting is online. And so that's important, but it's not necessarily the role of the federal government to guarantee it. Someone needs to guarantee it, but that can be state and local.
Mm-hmm. Well, in South Carolina, if you look at all federal funding, the state receives 14.4% from the federal government. and the rest is local and state funds. So in South Carolina, 14.4% of all funds that go to education is from the federal government. Now, this is from the Department of Education, from the Agriculture Department, and from Health and Human Services. So that gives you a perspective on, you know, just how much money. It certainly helps, but it doesn't really fund the education as much as state and local governments do. So what do you think American education will be like in 10 years, and what role do you think the federal government will have in public education? Dr. Swain?
Well, one thing is I don't expect the Department of Education to be abolished. And so I believe not in the near future. And when it comes to 10 years from now, I would hope that there would be less of a focus on, more of a focus on the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, science, and less on pushing certain types of agendas that are not educational. And I believe that so much has been exposed, and the concerns of parents cut across racial, ethnic, and political lines, that people are unhappy with what they've seen. And, you know, like all of us are appalled, I believe, by all of these, the stories that we read about what's happening in the classroom and things that are taking place with teachers. I would hope that there would be higher standards, more focus on the students and their needs. And I think the idea of parental choice, parents being more involved about what their children receive in the classroom, the quality of education, that we may see an expansion, certainly in the near future, of the rights of parents. And it should always be the parents, I believe, as the best person. The parent should be number one when it comes to knowing what's best for their own child. And I would like to see that to be a part of the future where it's not challenged. We never would assume that the government knows better than the parent about what their child needs.
Professor Black?
Yeah, I have, I guess the thing that keeps me up at night the most is the question that you ask: what will American education look like in 10 years? Because our public education institutions, which have educated more than 90% of Americans, are under enormous stress right now. I do worry about whether the concept of public education as something that we should invest in and guarantee to all children, whether it can survive. We're in a moment in which that system is fracturing, both through charters and vouchers. And as I tell people, if our public schools become the place where only poor children go to school, the public education project, as we have known it for our lives, is over. It will not come back. Right? And so that is fear number one. We have tried that route before. We had what they used to call pauper schools, P-A-U-P-E-R-S, in many states in the 1800s, and it didn't work. The idea that you can run a public system that's just for poor kids doesn't work. And it is ultimately, I think, the public schools that ask us to aspire to something larger than ourselves, to commit to a common good, to find common ground. And in a moment when we are clearly ripping ourselves apart, I actually think that public schools and the public common good is the only thing that we can hope to keep us together. If you think about it, right? Public schools are the singular institution in the United States of America, right? That says we come together, we theoretically enter on equal terms. Obviously, we come from different walks in life. And we set aside our differences for something larger. And if we lose that, if we retreat to our demographic silos, our racial silos, our religious silos, our socioeconomic silos in a private sector, I don't know how we would then come together in a public sector.
Dr. Swain?
Yeah, thank you. The fastest growing groups of homeschoolers now are Blacks and Hispanics. And so these parents are pulling their kids out of public education. And so one of the reasons that they're taking them out of public schools is that they're not happy with what they're getting. And so if this moment that we're in now, if public schools make the necessary changes and actually focus on educating children in the basics and not, pushing ideas such as math is racist, that some schools have lowered graduation standards and they believe everyone should pass. That's not what parents want. And so I think that the public schools are valuable. I went to public schools. They were very different. And in that segregated black school, I got a pretty good education in the segregated black schools, but I don't think the schools are the same quality as they were back in the 1960s. And I think that the public schools need to turn it around. They're not what they should be, and they're suffering as a consequence.
Well, I would, as I always say, there's never been a moment in the history of the United States of America when our schools, public schools, have been perfect. And I don't expect that they will be in my lifetime. But when we look at the broad arc of history, right, that has ultimately been the expansion of the ballot and the expansion of the public schools happening at the same time that has expanded democracy. And if we shrink that public sphere of public education, I don't know how we can continue to expand our democracy. And it's not to disagree with what Dr. Swain said. I made not a wealthy living, but I made a paycheck out of suing school districts for a period in my life. And so it's not a claim that they're perfect, but it's the idea that they ought to be.
I agree that they ought to be, too.
Let's look at the current policy conflicts. A few states have altered instruction on certain historical topics, such as enslaved people. The opposition to these actions have claimed that these policies are in violation of federal civil rights law. What is your reaction to these state actions and whether the federal government has a legitimate role to play? Professor Black?
Well, on the question of curriculum, I think hopefully Dr. Swain and I would have a pretty good deal of agreement on that. The federal government does not have a role to play in curriculum. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act clearly states the federal government cannot dictate curriculum. So, as much as some might want it or not want it, that's not an appropriate role. Now, I guess I would come back to my point earlier about overreach. This current administration is trying to dictate curriculum, substantive curriculum in terms of history, and so that gives me enormous pause. But I will say the First Amendment matters, and so moving away from the federal government, I think the biggest concern I have, and this cuts across political lines, is are our classrooms places where students are free to agree and disagree, that they are free from coercion of ideas with which they disagree. And that it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, religious or unreligious, all students have that right. And I guess I would confess that I think that some of our schools may have gotten a little bit too self-righteous over the last decade, and maybe out of good intent, maybe did not foster a wide debate in the way maybe they could have. But I think that's something we can fix. I think our educators want our students to be better civic citizens. So.
Dr. Swain?
I happen to know something about the states that have passed laws prohibiting divisive concepts. And it was framed as divisive concepts, but it was really aimed at critical race theory and some of the sexual gender theories that had worked their way into the classrooms. And the legislation that was put in place, I'm not aware of any. I've looked at Texas as well as Tennessee and a few other states have passed legislation. All of it is pretty much on the same model, but I don't know of any that prohibited teaching about the civil rights movement or teaching about slavery. A lot of it had to do, though, with when is it age appropriate. Like kids that are, below fourth grade, let's say fourth or fifth grade, I don't know that they need to be shown certain types of videos or things before they're old enough to process it. And so I think some kids were being literally traumatized, and there were teachers, that would teach things about race, and there were comments made to little white children about their ancestors. And when from my era, which was a long time ago, that whole idea of shaming children was something that, no one wanted to shame children. Well, it was the case that in many school districts, it was thought it was okay to shame white kids because somehow that was going to make them more racially sensitive. And this whole idea, that only white people can be racist. That was being taught, and that ideas were being pushed in the classroom that I would say took away from the teaching of the basic subjects and topics that children needed to know. And I can give a personal example. I have a 10-year-old great-grandson that's in a private school now because his great-grandmother put him in it. He's in the 3rd grade. He learns how to take a knee. He learns how to ask, is everything racist? He learns how to take the salt and pepper shaker and tell me that it's racist because the salt shaker has more holes. And I mean, this kid in 3rd grade, he was literally extremely bright, but not learning anything that he needed, such as his timetables. And so, I mean, I think that's sad, that he learns how to take a knee, he learns all this stuff about race, but he doesn't learn basic skills in the schools that he was in. And now that he's in private school, he tells me that in his inner city school where he was, the teachers didn't care if you slept all day in class. They just didn't care.
I mean, I guess I'll take a liberty of agreeing a little bit and disagreeing a little bit or a lot. So, I mean, look, I mean, I'm an academic as Dr. Swain is, and you're a reformed academic.
Right.
You know, I mean, the number of what I would call silly papers that are thoughtless in terms of using ism to define, you know, the beginning of time to the end of time are quite prevalent. And so, you know, we could have conversations about and debates about, you know, young people and their views of what is or isn't racism. That's one conversation. But I think, you know, the idea that our public schools were, you know, prevalently teaching critical race theory strikes me as a little bit inaccurate. I mean, I know Derek Bell, who actually was quite kind to me, a white rural person, when I was a student at the University of Tennessee. I said, if Derek Bell is a destroyer of white men, he certainly failed with me because he certainly had a positive impact on me. And I think he'd be rolling over in his grave right now with the idea that somehow or another the public school teachers across the country were teaching critical race theory. I had to file an expert report in Florida, and I said, you know, there actually isn't a clear definition of what is or isn't critical race theory. It's just a loose collection of scholars, some of which agreed about certain things and disagreed about certain things. And, you know, the idea that our public school teachers were critical race theorists, I'm not so sure of that. What I was more sure of was that the Republican National Committee during the midterms decided that the way that they would drive turnout, and they were explicit about this, was to tell a story about critical race theory in the public schools. And so I think, you know, are there stories of the sort that Dr. Swain describes? You know, surely things happen, but the idea that there was some widespread movement, I didn't see that, I haven't seen that, and I think it was a political narrative to drive people to the polls, to turn people against our public schools.
And I disagree because I've seen the books, and so what happened, how did it get into the public schools, is that people that were steeped in it wrote children's books. And so the books and the curriculum, and some of the books were not allowed to come home. And the reason we know it is because students, kids, as well as teachers in the public schools that disagreed, took pictures of some of the curriculum that was out there. And so it wasn't that they were teaching Derek Bell or Delgado or any of the critical race theories. They were not taking law books and teaching them in public schools. People steeped in those theories created curricula, they created materials that found their way in the public schools.
I mean, look, there are books in the library that have lots of ideas that I agree with, and there's books in the library that I disagree with. But, you know, at least when it comes to South Carolina schools, they've got a curriculum, they've got history benchmarks they got to meet, and unfortunately, they march through that quite quickly without getting into theory, but simply trying to get students to memorize dates quite often that may not be that important. So the idea that somehow or another that these teachers are more concerned with teaching critical race theory rather than teaching to the standards that the state of South Carolina demands they teach to, again, I'm skeptical of it.
Again, look, I taught at colleges and universities for 28 years, and I saw how it's found its way into every department of the university, including mathematics. And so, you know, what you said as far as, oh, they're not teaching critical race theory, they're veiled and all of it. It's a university concept. That was the talking point that was used whenever it was brought up. But I, as someone that was actually involved in it, I read the books, I saw what was taking place, I talked with the teachers, I saw the materials, and so it was actually taking place. I think that we would, our young people, if you care about K through 12 education, they would be better educated if they focused on the basics, and I don't know that there was a lot of value added. And I don't believe that some people, teachers are teachers, you know, they're individuals, they can do all sorts of things, but I'm not aware of any places where they said you can't teach about slavery, you cannot teach about race, but I am aware of discussions where people said that it needed to come at a certain age group, that it shouldn't be, you know, kindergarten kids or kids, you know, below middle school. And so that was part of the debate, and that was why some of that legislation got passed. But it was passed, I believe 24, 25 states across the country passed legislation banning divisive concepts, and a lot of it was not enforced. People just went around it, but it did get passed at the state level.
All right, let's talk about how we have collaboration and effectiveness. Dr. Swain, what areas of education policy, if any, offer the most promising opportunities for bipartisan agreement in the federal-state partnership?
Well, I mean, federal, state, I think everything is so much in flux that I don't know what the answer to that would be today. I think things are changing in a way that I don't know the answer.
Okay, Professor Black?
Well, as Dr. Swain said earlier, things are changing and they change quickly, but you know, I do think there's a lot of room around civics. I mean, there was a bipartisan bill introduced by, I'm forgetting the senator from Texas, but it was a Texas and Delaware senator about 6 years ago during the first Trump administration. Right? Our civics education, the purpose of education as preparing citizens, I think is something that people of all political parties can agree upon. Now, certainly, you know, I think Dr. Swain and I might be testament to how when we get down to the nitty-gritty, we may begin to disagree about things, but I think we all can agree that our schools should be doing a better job preparing students for their role as voters and as citizens. And, you know, I think we really need to find that common ground, because that's how we created these institutions to begin with, right, was to prepare young people not to get jobs. I mean, we certainly hope that that's what they do, but ultimately to be citizens. And so I hope we can do that. Again, unfortunately, I think the current leadership at the federal level has a stranglehold around bipartisanship. And so even if there is wide bipartisan support, the leadership doesn't necessarily support that. And sometimes that could be both parties that present that challenge. But at this moment...
We've got about one more minute.
Okay. And I'll just finally say, Title I dollars go to 97% of the school districts in this country. And the idea that we're going to start pulling back funds from our public institutions so that the federal government can, you know, leverage its policies on schools seems to me something that there's no bipartisan support for. It just happens to be that the current administration is using that power or misusing that power, in my opinion.
So if y'all could, one more question, and just take 1 minute each, and then the president of Allen University, Dr. Ernest McNeely, wants to come up and close out the program. So here's the last question. Looking ahead 10 years, what role, if any, should the federal government play to ensure that American higher education remains globally competitive? Professor Black, you want to?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, number one, closing our borders isn't going to do that. The sort of genius of America is that it has been open and is a global leader. And so right now we are losing talent from across this world that is migrating to other places. I don't think that's a good thing. Our institutions are losing research money, right? I don't think that's a good thing. So I do think the federal government plays an important role in spurring technology and innovation at the federal level. That doesn't mean that it needs to be heavy-handed about what those ideas are, but I think it does play a crucially important role in research, and it needs to continue to do so, I think, over the next 10 years.
Dr. Swain?
I think it's important for the federal government to hold institutions of higher education to high standards, and that there's not a lot of evidence that institutions police themselves. And as a faculty member at two very elite institutions, I can tell you that there was no free speech for people who were conservative, and I was not always conservative. There was a sea change, and so the federal government needs to protect civil rights. If you are a person of faith, you're not welcomed on many college campuses, so there's a lot to be done. And the thing about the bipartisanship, you mentioned civic education. I would agree with you, but I was the vice chair of a commission that we were supposed to develop a bipartisan plan to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation. And on day one of the Biden administration, that was eliminated by executive order. And it was a bipartisan initiative, and it was all about education. And so I don't know that we will have bipartisanship like it once existed. I believe it once existed. It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, thank you both for being here, and we appreciate everyone who's here in person. And now we have President Dr. Ernest McNeely, who's the president of Allen University, to close out our evening.
Well, I hope that all of you have found the discussion to be worthwhile, and certainly the fact that there are opinions that can be articulated, though never to come together to agreement. And of course, the Institute on Civility is not about necessarily arriving at points of agreement, but to engage civilly in our disagreements. And certainly for our students and our audience, we should, as an institution of higher education, remind everyone that there are facts in our world. There aren't multiple sets of facts. There are multiple there are multiple opinions, but for those of us who value higher education, the quest, the search for facts about whatever impacts our lives is critically important, and certainly to the extent that the Boeing Institute can provide opportunities for you to see differing opinions shared civilly. We're quite pleased that we're involved in bringing that to you. And certainly we look forward to having you join us on our next occasion. Thank you very much. Good evening.